So, Big Finish, am I right? Obtained the rights to produce Doctor Who audio dramas in 1999, and ever since then numerous actors from the classic series, and eventually the revival, began flocking into their recording studios because, hey, it's an extra paycheck. Sadly, however, some actors had, shall we say, fled this plane of existence prior to the company's formation, and among those no longer with us are the first three actors to play the Doctor: William Hartnell, Patrick Troughton, and Jon Pertwee. And that kinda sucks, because on top of, well, not being alive, it means they can't continue to play make-believe for our entertainment in these ear stories. But that doesn't stop the Big Finish writers from creating new adventures with these Doctors anyway, via circumventional methods like getting in impressionists or sound-alikes to portray them, or specifically crafting the scripts to have their respective companions narrate what their Doctors would do or say in any given scenario. But in 2015, they tried a different approach. Seeking more opportunities to utilise the companion actors of the first three Doctors in their full cast main range, but also striving for something more experimental than a school reunion type affair, Big Finish crafted the Locum Doctors Trilogy, a name I'm taking from the initial press announcement of these stories. The basic premise is that, during what would be relatively bog standard and typical adventures of the first, second and third Doctors, some strange temporal displacement happens, removing them from these respective scenarios and substituting future incarnations in their places, and the tension of this situation arises from A. the confusion and character tension between the misplaced Doctor and their former selves' companions, and B. how differently the adventure would play out from having the misplaced Doctor with his different attitudes and tactics at the helm. It is an interesting premise, ripe for some engaging drama and some fun dynamic shifts for the TARDIS teams in question, and as someone who personally favours the eras of the first three, well, 4 Doctors, the most out of the entire franchise, this experiment is of particular interest to me. So, let's take a look at this trilogy. Let's see how it plays out. The trilogy opens with The Defectors, written by Nicholas Briggs. One day at Unit HQ, Jo Grant is shocked to discover that all of her military colleagues have been dismissed, finding a suspicious Captain Cornelius in their place, who's under orders to take both her and the Doctor to a secret base on Delphin Isle, but not elaborating on why for reasons of national security. Very hush-hush and all that, what? And things get even more unnerving for Jo when the Doctor who emerges from the unit's lab isn't the tall frilly dandy she's familiar with, but a small, more introspective fellow in a question mark jumper. Upon being taken to the island, the dodginess of the situation escalates, with an eerie fishing village falling into disrepair, Jo's attempts at communicating with her colleagues being blocked, and an almost smothering level of secrecy from the military personnel. With no one else to turn to, it seems Jo has no choice but to confide in this replacement Doctor with a question mark umbrella. This opening story certainly lives up to the intended vision of the trilogy. While probably not the most typical Third Doctor premise, it certainly feels like it could slot very snugly into that period of the franchise, at times giving me vibes of other Earth-based Third Doctor outings with unnerving isolated communities like the Sea Devils or the Demons. That said, it's also an uneasy subversion of the typical Third Doctor format. After all, while there is a strong military presence in this story, it's not the typically helpful squadrons of unit headed by the familiar and comforting leadership of Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart. Instead, the military figures here are shadowy and secretive, deliberately keeping Jo and the Doctor, and by extension us, in the dark about their intentions and what all of this is about, and acting almost oblivious to abnormal details. It throws you off and puts you outside of your comfort zone when a format you're so used to with a particular Doctor is inverted in such a way. But naturally it gets even more bizarre when you change out the very Doctor in it as well. While Jo doesn't outright reject the notion that this different man is the Doctor, mostly because this is set after the 3 Doctors for her so she knows how there are other incarnations, there are still mild tensions between them because of the 7th Doctor's much more uncertain and unassuming disposition, which sets Jo on edge since she's used to confiding in the much more upfront assertion of the 3rd Doctor. Seven is also naturally kind of bewildered as to why he's even here, and contemplates over whether it's because he needs to do something that his former self otherwise wouldn't have thought to do. But more on that later on. Unfortunately, once the veil of secrecy is lifted around episode 3, it does become a bit less engaging, mostly because by that point the 7th Doctor and Jo have been separated by circumstances, so the drive of hearing these two unlikely allies interacting is kind of absent for a significant portion of the runtime. And also because the ultimate alien threat turns out to be of the typical grating, barely intelligible voice changer variety that unfortunately plagues numerous other Big Finish plays too. Still, the ending where Jo ultimately sets things on track is neat enough, and the adventure is overall a fun time with the 7th Doctor slotting in surprisingly well into a 3rd Doctor story. So, I think it's all very well and good. The middle of the trilogy comes in the form of The Last of the Cybermen, penned by Alan Barnes. On a planetoid at the edge of the Kuiper Belt, a cyber beacon is stationed, left derelict after the cyber wars, and within it is housed a dormant cyber planner, waiting for the right power-hungry humans to come along, solve its logic gates, and reactivate it. When the TARDIS lands there, the 2nd Doctor had set out to investigate it by himself, and ultimately assessed that the situation was best left alone. But when Jamie and Zoe eventually go out to search for him and instead find the 6th Doctor in his place, the confused trio inevitably end up embroiled in a logician's quest to break into the beacon and salvage the technology. It goes as well as you'd expect, and worse. When the logician turns out to have ambitions of teaming up with the Cybermen, Zoe ends up enslaved to the cyber planner, and the situation escalates scarily close to reigniting the cyber wars. I'm unfortunately a bit mixed on this installment. So, the typical 2nd Doctor scenario they've used as groundwork to build this Locum Doctor adventure on was clearly influenced by the Tomb of the Cybermen. What with the background context of a cyber extinction event, a human expedition wanting to break into a derelict Cyberman structure, a logician traitor among the cast, traps galore within the infrastructure including cybermats, etc. Not a bad foundation to build on. Far from it, I dare say. Tomb of the Cybermen is phenomenal. My favourite Doctor Who story of all time, as a matter of fact. So, you'd think anything using it as a basis would automatically earn my adoration. Thing is though, it suffers from the same issue that the vast majority of 2nd Doctor expanded media suffers from. There's just no sparkle to it. One of the many aspects that makes Tomb of the Cybermen work so beautifully well is its sense of exploration. It almost feels like you're unearthing thick layers of untold Cyberman mythology with each new room the characters wander into. That feeling just isn't recaptured here in the slightest. It's a very matter-of-fact copy and paste of the story structure. A logician wants to enter an abandoned Cyberman building, the group weave their way through a handful of traps and solve a few logic gates, and then the penny drops as the logician reveals their traitorous side and reactivates a prominent authoritarian figure in the cyber race. I know it might seem a bit unfair to hold this story so closely to Tomb of the Cybermen standards, but when it's so clearly using it as a narrative basis, you can understand my frustration when it just lacks a similar star quality. Then the adventure proceeds to take a bizarre time travel turn in the final part, which plunges the Doctor right back into the climax of the Cyber Wars, and it kinda leaves me at a loss, not gonna lie. Of course, there's the Locum Doctor aspect itself, which does liven it up a bit from being too much of a mundane rehash, and admittedly, it is interesting to see a slightly more confrontational edge in the 6th Doctor and Jamie's dynamic in comparison to the two Doctors. But I do think they missed a trick in not opting to go with the 6th Doctor's more TV-accurate, brasher personality here. Because as functional and endearing as his more mild-mannered demeanour from his post-Evelyn days is, it does feel like the contrast between him and the Doctor he's standing in for isn't as stark and drastic as it otherwise could have been, which kind of strikes me as a missed opportunity. Ultimately, as perfectly listenable and functional as this adventure is, I don't think it tapped the full potential it could have achieved. The trilogy closes off and reaches its dramatic climax with The Secret History, scripted by Eddie Robson. The Doctor, Stephen and Vicky arrive at the Siege of Ravenna in 504 AD, and end up accompanying the Byzantine general Belisarius to Constantinople when he is recalled there by the Emperor. The trouble is, the wrong Doctor is present for this adventure, the 5th being in place of the 1st, and the pressure is on him to make sure that the adventure plays out exactly as it would have done had his former self been here. However, it soon becomes apparent that one of the Doctor's oldest rivals is pulling the strings, and has made it impossible for him to keep the timeline on track. Of the 3 stories that comprise this Locum Doctors trilogy, this one certainly feels the most frenetic. The tale deceptively starts out relatively conventionally, a fairly routine First Doctor pure historical that just so happens to have a different Doctor at the helm. And the pure historical part of the story is still pretty entertaining as it is, particularly Stephen's subplot as he gets kidnapped and taken to Constantinople to run errands at a chariot racing tournament. And on top of that, the 5th Doctor and Vicky have a surprisingly investing bond. But this adventure undergoes one of the most radical creative shifts I've ever seen in a Doctor Who story, because by the time the cliffhanger to episode 3 comes along, the meddling monk has shown his face, flanked by a time-sensitive Greek lady and a pair of floating stone alien Medusa heads who can cure diseases, and he's baited the Doctor into royally messing up his own timeline and then taken it over for himself so that he can be the Doctor, but more reckless and interfering. Well, that certainly escalated quickly. In a way, I suppose this narrative swerve does make it the most captivating of the trilogy, considering the Locum Doctor format actually ends up derailing the adventure into a whirlwind of complete chaos. It turns out that the monk had orchestrated this whole Doctor swapping saga in the first place, hoping to corrupt and take over the Doctor's timeline as revenge for events that happen later down the line. And he just so happened to get it 3rd time lucky here. Fairly understandably, because it's with the 5th Doctor, whose overall main character arc is essentially about failing to achieve the most ideal outcome. But then naturally, like in all of these timeline warping scenarios, it ends with the whole scheme blowing up spectacularly in the monk's face and the timeline snaps back to normal. Well, all's well that ends well, right? So ultimately, I think the Locum Doctors trilogy was an interesting experiment, to say the least. Not without its flaws, of course. In some areas it disappointingly struggles to even scratch the surface of its full potential. But it was certainly an interesting alternate method for doing more full cast adventures with the first 3 Doctors, but just without, well, the first 3 Doctors. I give it a you can't go wrong, pick it up I guess, out of 10.